So, I've been talking about MOBAs a lot as of late, thanks to my fascination with Deadlock, and while I was chatting with all of you in the comments, I noticed somewhat of a pattern. Now, I'll admit this is extremely anecdotal. My videos don't exactly get massive numbers, and the kinds of people that would comment on one of my MOBA videos are naturally going to be biased towards longer term MOBA players. But what I thought was interesting was just how insanely high the playtime was from some of these people that were in my comments. Like, we're talking about thousands and thousands of hours. These guys have been playing MOBAs for years, if not decades at this point. And the reason why I found this curious was more about the lack of anyone who had less than thousands of hours of playtime. Like, it seems as if either you have already been playing MOBAs for thousands and thousands of hours, or you don't play them at all. There is just no in between. It's like nobody has only just got into MOBAs. Like, everybody is a longtime veteran or they don't play them. And this kind of sort of plays into the paradox of the MOBA genre as a whole that I've been learning about. MOBAs are huge. League of Legends still hosts massive yearly events. Games like Dota are pulling in hundreds of thousands of players still, which consistently keeps it near the top of Steam's most played games charts. And yet, despite that, they also have this reputation of being a very difficult genre to get into. So, combining all of that information together, the high player counts despite the steep learning curve, the fact that so many of the people playing have been doing so for so long, with so few people having got into it more recently, which is undoubtedly related to the overall declining player counts over the last few years. It all leads me to one conclusion. MOBAs must have literally been easier to get into in the past, and then something changed and it became harder to learn how to play these games over time. Now, there are a number of possible explanations for this, but right off the bat, I feel like I want to disqualify changes to the game's design itself. And there's two reasons why I want to do that. For one, I just highly doubt that the design of games like Dota and League have really changed so dramatically for the worse over these years so as to cause this genre-wide issue between them. Like it would, I could maybe see one game making some mistakes and losing players over time, but both of them and a lot of other MOBAs as well. I mean, like, don't get me wrong, there are definitely aspects of these MOBA games that probably aren't helping things, like the fact that they keep adding so many new heroes over time is often attributed as a big reason for why it keeps being harder and harder to get into these games. But like, to argue against that idea, it seems like at the peak of the MOBA genre, at least when talking about games like League and Dota, like that was around like the mid 2010s, like 2014 to 2016, seems to be when like the MOBA genre was at its height. And by that point, games like League already had well over 100 characters in the game. So like, if you really think about it from the perspective of a new player, does it really make that much of a difference whether there's 100 characters or closer to 200 characters like there is today? Either way, we are long past the point where a new player can quickly learn what all of the different characters do. So like, speaking from experience, I really don't feel like that kind of hero count inflation really makes that much of a difference, because they already passed that threshold of it being a problem well over a decade ago, and at this point the numbers basically don't matter. But of course, another reason that I don't really want to talk too in depth about the design of these games directly is because I just am not experienced in them, as I have demonstrated in some of my more recent videos. I just haven't really played League or Dota all that much. I have single-digit hours of playtime in both of them, and frankly, I'm just not qualified enough to speak on the nuance of how their designs have changed over the years. So by all means, let me know down in the comments if you are a longtime League or Dota fan, and you think that there are some design decisions that they have made to the game that have actively made it worse or harder to get into over the years. But I think that I'm going to try and focus on some other reasons that I think are relevant to why the MOBA genre has been on the decline. So, to move on from the design of these games, something that I think could be a significant factor is the player base. And no, I am not talking about toxicity, although, again, the toxic reputation of fan bases like League certainly doesn't help things. But no, what I am referring to is something that actually happens a lot in other niche genres like fighting games, where the player base tends to end up outskilling new players over time. The idea being that when a game like first comes out, you have all kinds of people with all levels of skill all coming into the game at the same time. So it's really easy for anyone from, lower to high skill levels to get in while the going's good and find games with other players of their own skill level that they can match with and thus have a good time and then be able to learn and improve at a steady pace. But over time, especially when we're talking about these kinds of games that like League and Dota that have been around for over a decade, the average person that has been just playing those games regularly for hundreds, if not thousands of hours, has ended up getting so skilled compared to where a new player tends to start, so that anyone trying to join the game now is going to be hopelessly outclassed by even the least skilled veterans that have been playing for years. Thus, as a result, new players keep getting matched with people that are way above their skill level and then end up getting stomped the second they join, which in turn means they're not going to end up having much fun, and the game gets a reputation for being unfriendly to newbies, and they end up quitting long before they have a chance to improve. But I don't think that this is fully the problem either. And I'll admit, this is again mostly just going off of my own personal experience that I've had trying to learn about these games over the last few months. Like when I was trying to get into like League and Dota, I didn't really have problems getting into games with people that at least seemed to be around my skill level. At the very least, I had no problem getting carried into plenty of victories in my first few games. So, I wasn't experiencing this kind of pub stomping that you might expect from such an old player base. Maybe I got lucky, or maybe the game just secretly put me up against bots or something. I know some games actually do that, like I think Fortnite does, but either way, I'm not sure if I could attribute the decline of the MOBA genre's popularity to this as the problem. But what does that leave us with? If the design of the game themselves hasn't changed so dramatically so as to ruin the game over time, and the community of the game isn't really the problem that's turning away new players, well then, how come it's so much harder to learn a MOBA today than it was, 10, 15, 20 years ago? Well, what I think has changed quite significantly, in fact, is the overall gaming landscape itself. See, one of the things that a lot of people comment in Deadlock's favor is that the shooter genre is just apparently an inherently more intuitive genre for people to learn. Honestly, I've probably even said something like that myself in some of my videos, but thinking about that phrase, that shooters are just, inherently more intuitive, I'm just not very satisfied with that as a justification, because it doesn't really explain why shooters are more intuitive. It just kind of assumes that they are because of how popular they are. And I mean, sure, you can probably argue that specific shooters are easier to learn. I mean, most of these games don't have mechanics like a shop system, and usually their maps are far smaller and more straightforward in their design. They don't typically have like 3 lanes to manage and things like that. But at the same time, you also have games like Battle Royales and extraction shooters that do have massive, gigantic maps with tons of different mechanics to keep track of and all the loot that you have to try and get and find and adapt to on the fly. And there are also lots of examples of popular shooters with their own complicated mechanics, like Titanfall with its whole jetpack assisted parkour movement system on top of the ability to, of course, summon giant robots that you can pilot and lose mid-fight. And I mean, needless to say, we also have Deadlock. This game literally has most of the same mechanics that MOBAs have that are usually attributed to why they're so hard to learn, like a shop system and having to manage waves and the 3-lane map and everything. And yet, it is still often attributed as being far easier to pick up despite having all of those mechanics. So I don't think it's productive to just claim that one genre or type of game is inherently magically more intuitive than a different genre, just as a fact of nature. There's just too many individual factors of these games to consider. And like, even if we try to put aside a lot of the more nuanced mechanics that you find between these genres, like, is it really just more intuitive to aim and with a mouse and move with a keyboard or a joystick than it is to control units with a mouse? You know, like, what is it about these, first and third person shooters that makes them so popular and allegedly easy to learn compared to these top down MOBAs? Well, one difference that I thought of is that there are a lot of shooters out there that aren't multiplayer games. Sure, a lot of the most popular shooters out there are multiplayer focused. Marvel Rivals, Overwatch, Fortnite. Hell, the one game on Steam that consistently ranks higher than Dota is Counter-Strike. But there are also a lot of multiplayer shooters that have single-player campaigns. I mean, think about games like Halo, which practically defined the shooter genre in the early 2000s. Like, for a while, games were literally just called Halo killers in response to its popularity. And like, yeah, the multiplayer modes were the stars of the show in the long run, but before people played multiplayer, I think the majority of Halo fans would first play through that single-player story mode. And there are also countless games like Half-Life or Doom or Ultra Kill that are entirely single-player focused shooters that come out every year. And the reason why I think that this matters is because I've always personally believed that one of the best ways to learn how to play one of these more complicated multiplayer genres is through a well-designed and crafted single-player campaign. In a multiplayer game, you have to be thrown into the deep end right away. When you're playing against other people, the game kind of has to balance itself evenly for a 50% win rate. That's just kind of the nature of the genre. And, as such, there tends to not be any forms of real, progression, because that would cause an imbalance in the game. All of the systems and mechanics have to be unlocked from the start and introduced to the player at generally around the same time. And if there's any kind of onboarding process at all, it usually just amounts to a simple series of tutorials or just like a practice area where they kind of just expect the player to mess around and figure things out on their own. But in a single player game, you can design the game to be beaten, like with the expectation that the player will overcome whatever challenge you put in front of them, and design it so that the game loses and the player wins. There can be progression where the player is only handed a fraction of the game's mechanics to start with, and then they have time to familiarize themselves with every new mechanic as it's introduced through gameplay in a way that can be far more enjoyable than just going through a boring series of missions as a tutorial. Like, hell, if a game is designed clever enough, the player should not even realize that they're experiencing a tutorial. I've talked about this before, but one of my favorite examples of this kind of thing is still Ravenholm from Half-Life 2. Right before this level starts, the game gives you its signature weapon, the gravity gun, the most iconic weapon of the Half-Life series, and it basically allows you to pick up and throw around physics objects because that was a big deal back in 2004. And right off the bat, the game starts tutorializing you, but instead of just popping up a boring menu or making you play through a mission or whatever, it has you play fetch with dogs using the gun's mechanics to throw around these balls in a big open and safe area where no enemies will spawn. And so by framing it as this game of fetch with an adorable character, it makes it feel like a fun, engaging activity so that they don't have to stop you and be like, okay, Gordon, time to press the X button to launch the, whatever, it's, you get to actually have fun playing the game when it's actually teaching you a central mechanic. And then, of course, right after you play fetch, you then get cut off from the rest of the group and you're forced to go through Ravenholm, which is a huge level that purposefully doesn't give the player very much ammo to work with, which means that even if you don't pick up the message from that fetch tutorial that you should probably be using the gravity gun, the fact that you will inevitably run out of ammo for most of your other weapons will leave you you with basically only two options: your melee crowbar, which is a less than ideal weapon to use against zombies, and your gravity gun, who has basically unlimited ammo because it's only limited by whatever physics objects happen to be in the area around you. And wouldn't you know it, but Ravenholm is also a lumber mill that inexplicably has tons of giant metal saw blades just lying around that you can pick up with the gravity gun and fire at zombies at Mach 7. The point of this tangent is that this is the real reason why shooters are so much more intuitive than a lot of other genres. It's not because it's magically inherently easier for people to learn how to aim with a mouse or whatever. It's that there have been tons and tons of these kinds of single player shooters that act as great tutorials for the genre as a whole by helping you learn how to aim and move around in these gameplay systems in a safe single player environment that is designed for the player to be able to succeed and have fun while doing it. And as a result, you develop a lot of skills while playing these single player games that you can then transfer over into the multiplayer shooters and be able to basically pick them up in minutes instead of hours. Like when I first played a game like Marvel Rivals or Overwatch or Helldivers or whatever, like I didn't really need to read a tutorial on how to aim my gun or whatever, because I've already played 100 other shooters that have taught me these skills. So I could just go into these games with those skills already developed and already be shooting bugs in the face in seconds. And this idea of transferable skills applies to most other genres as well. You know, platformers are a mostly single player genre, or at best tend to be co-op over PvP, and as a result they tend to all have easy to learn progression levels, and that in turn makes it much easier to play any future platformer you play. You know, if you play Mario 64 and you play it to completion, well then it's going to be a lot easier to play a game like Mario Odyssey down the line, you know. People also talk about this a lot with fighting games. You know, fighting games are famously a difficult genre to get into, like MOBAs, but the same concept applies. You know, for those that were able to push past that initial barrier, you know, once you learn one fighting game, it tends to be a lot easier to learn any future fighting game that you play, because while they all have different characters with their own fancy moves and meters and whatnot, most fighting games still share the same basic fundamental mechanics about blocking and spacing and all these motion inputs and whatnot. And so as a result, if you learn one fighting game, well then you've kind of learned them all, or at least you're on a much better foot to learn any other fighting game. But that of course finally brings us back to the MOBA genre, and like fighting games, it could be easily argued that once you get good at one MOBA, it becomes far easier to get good at other MOBAs as you build up the more general skills you need to play them. But that also doesn't really solve our problem or answer our original question, because like fighting games, it is still hard for a new player today to push past that initial barrier. This doesn't really solve or explain why onboarding new players has seemingly gotten harder over the last decade than it has in the decades prior. And it's not like there's a single player version of a MOBA that people could have been learning in, right? I mean, the M in MOBA literally stands for multiplayer. Well, except, what were the original MOBAs? Well, the first ever MOBAs to ever get made were, of course, Defense of the Ancients, aka Dota, and Aeon of Strife, which didn't start out as standalone titles. These two games were both originally mods for Warcraft 3 and StarCraft. And more importantly to this discussion, those games that they were modding had single-player campaigns. Now sure, StarCraft and Warcraft are RTS, or real-time strategy games, so they're not exactly the same as a MOBA. They are a different genre, but seeing as the MOBA genre literally spawned as a mod from these games, they obviously share a lot of the same fundamental mechanics, especially with the way that you interface with the game from that top-down commander perspective with your mouse commanding units and whatnot. The way that you tell where your units where they have to go, the way that you navigate the map and interact with the menus and the UI. Sure, a lot of mechanics in these games are different, but if anything, the MOBA genre genre is kind of a streamlined version of the RTS genre. Instead of commanding an entire army of units at once, you only have to worry about a single hero that you command for the whole match. And instead of having to build up a base and expand out to gather resources and build more units and infrastructure, you just kind of got to build items that buff your character. So between the streamlined mechanics and this similar interface that RTS gamers are used to, well, then it makes sense that RTS fans that learned from those Warcraft and StarCraft campaigns would take much more naturally to the MOBA genre that was literally built as a mod to these existing games. Now, I'm not saying that every single person that is into MOBAs today must have come from an RTS background, but I wouldn't be shocked if a lot of them were. I mean, at the very least, I know that in the early days with those original mods, you literally had to own an RTS in order to play those MOBAs. So it makes sense to me that even after these games branched off into their own launchers, a lot of people were still probably entering the MOBA space after cutting their teeth on their favorite RTS of choice. And the RTS genre as a whole was still pretty popular all the way throughout the 2000s and the early 2010s. In fact, it was around the mid-2010s or so that the RTS genre really started to fall off in popularity, coincidentally around the same time that MOBAs were also reaching their peak as well. Like, for reference, in 2016, that was when the last StarCraft 2 expansion came out, and while there definitely are still some RTS games getting made, they're nowhere near as high profile or popular as they used to be before that time in the mid-2010s. I mean, I remember, even as an outsider who never really played any of these games myself, like, you really could not escape the buzz that games like StarCraft had back in the day. That game was practically synonymous with esports for a while. But, of course, that also might have been part of the issue. Browsing some forums regarding this topic, a general consensus that I saw come up a lot is that the RTS genre as a whole fell off in popularity because of that focus on esports. Like, sure, it was great advertising, and it turned games like StarCraft 2 into household names for a while, but chasing that trend and trying to appeal to the most hardcore of competitive players also meant that they were no longer appealing to the more casual market that tends to make up the majority of most of these kinds of player bases. I mean, I remember a similar thing happened to Overwatch. That game was huge for years, and then they started up that Overwatch League esports thing, and they tried to build and balance the entire game around that competitive esports crowd, and that ended up causing a lot of more casual players to get turned off and leave for other games. But the difference is that there are still always tons of other shooters getting made for people to swap over when the one they're playing just doesn't appeal to them anymore. But it seems like most of the RTS games at the time were following along with that same StarCraft 2 trend, and there just weren't nearly as many to fall back onto for that casual experience. And as a result, the entire genre started to decline in popularity, which leads to this kind of feedback loop where fewer and fewer RTS games end up getting made because of the lack of interest and people and studios shifting to try and capitalize on more popular genres with what is perceived as a wider appeal, until we get to where we are today, where, like I said, the real-time strategy genre still exists, but it has become so much more niche today compared to where it used to be, especially, like I said, at the height of games like StarCraft 2. At best, more casual fans likely ended up falling back to more turn-based strategy games, like XCOM and the like, where you can play at your own pace and thus much more easily appeal to the more casual crowd. But despite still being strategy games, these turn-based games, they just don't teach the same kind of important real-time reactionary skills and decision-making that you need to play a MOBA. It's just too different of an environment. It'd be like like trying to learn how to do spell rotations in an MMO from playing Magic the Gathering. It just didn't make any sense. So as a result, MOBAs have literally lost their onboarding process. You used to be able to pick up an RTS like Warcraft or Command and Conquer or whatever, learn the mechanics through a lengthy single player campaign, and then you could graduate to playing online RTSs or MOBA games and whatnot when you were ready. But now that that doesn't happen nearly as often anymore, it's just no longer an option for most players. So, yeah, I mean, I'll admit, maybe I'm the one that's, just out of the loop and this was common knowledge to everyone other than me, but it just kind of makes sense to me, right? I mean, maybe somebody has a better explanation, but I do think it literally used to be easier to learn how to play a MOBA. Not because the MOBAs themselves were that different back in the day, but because the gaming environment as a whole used to have more games that worked like MOBAs did. So you were more likely to grow up learning and developing the relevant kinds of skills that you would need, and as a result, the transition to learning a MOBA was that much easier. But now that the landscape has shifted and all of those single-player RTSs have fallen into obscurity, we're now left with just the MOBAs that sprang out of that genre, but without the rest of the genre to support them. The shallow end of the pool has been dug out, and now you have no choice but to dive straight for the deep end and just hope that you can come back up for air. Except, of course, for Deadlock, which, as lots of people have been saying, is clearly designed very differently from these more traditional top-down MOBAs. And I think that, intentionally or otherwise, Deadlock has been designed to kind of capitalize off of the kinds of skills that you would learn from much more common shooters and platformers, which are far more popular to this day, with tons of single-player games to help onboard new players coming out every single year. So while it might seem harder for a MOBA player that might be more used to the more RTS format, it's a lot easier for someone like me who grew up playing those kinds of shooters and platformers to use those skills to learn how to play Deadlock. But, as always, I'm happy to continue the conversation in the comments down below. Does my theory here make any sense at all, or have I just been talking out my ass for however long this video is? I'm really curious to see if my hypothesis about a lot of older MOBA fans being RTS fans is true, and conversely, if people who have just never even touched the RTS genre also tend to have a harder time, like myself, learning MOBAs. I mean, hell, maybe in the future, if I want to make another attempt at learning a game like Dota, instead of just trying to grind the tutorial or something, maybe I should track down a copy of Warcraft 3 and play through that story mode to see if that helps build up the right kinds of skills so that I can get better at just basic things like controlling my character and attacking enemies and whatnot. But for now, if you liked the video, make sure to leave me a like and hit that subscribe button if you want to see more content like this in the future. And if you want to help support the channel more directly, there's a link to my Ko-Fi in the description down below. Thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you all in the next one.